In 2010, somebody gave me a gift certificate at Christmas time for Kepler's bookstore in Menlo Park. And I grew up in Menlo Park and had been going to Kepler's most of my life and knew that it was one of my favorite bookstores on the San Francisco Peninsula. So I was looking forward to going in there and choosing at least one really good book. Well, the day I went in, I just, when you walk into Kepler's, it's overwhelming. There's so many books, it's hard to choose. So I walked up to the lady that always works there, and I asked if she had a book that she would recommend. In fact, I asked her, is there a particular book you've read this past year that is your favorite? And without missing a beat, she said, Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. And I hadn't heard of Unbroken at that point. Now it's been a movie, and some of you, I'm sure, have seen it. But I said, well, how many books have you read this year? Just to make sure that she's read enough to be able to recommend. And she goes, well, I read about 4 or 5 books a week. And I thought, a couple hundred, 250, okay, she qualifies. So I asked her to tell me a little bit about Unbroken, and as soon as she started, I knew that I was going to be walking out of Kepler's bookstore with Unbroken in a bag. What I didn't know is that I would read it in about 2 days, because it was virtually impossible to put down. So if you don't know about Unbroken, it's about the life and the amazing experiences of Louis Zamperini during World War II. So as the book goes, during World War II, about 850 miles south of Oahu, an American bomber crash landed in the Pacific, and nobody else was around. And the scene was basically broken bits of plane all over the place, floating on the water, along with oil and hydraulic fluid, and 3 men who were still alive. The others on the plane didn't make it, but the 3 men were the pilot, known as Phil, the sergeant, known as Mac, and then the lieutenant, Louis Zamperini. Now, Louis was one of these people who just tried to do his very best at life, no matter what he had taken on. In fact, when he was in high school, he held the record for the high school mile. He was a runner, and it was 19 years before somebody else broke his record. And this was back in the 30s. When he was in college, he went to USC, and he held the college record for 15 years. Louis Zamperini actually competed in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin and actually did really well. As I was reading up about him this last week, I realized that the great Jesse Owens was his roommate during the Olympics in Berlin in 1936. Louis Zamperini was the person to watch during the 1940 Olympics, and everyone expected him to get a gold medal. But as you probably know, the 1940 Olympics never happened because World War II broke out. But Louis Zamperini was one of those persons that was a fighter, and he was going to do his very best, no matter what, to get better at whatever he did, not only to survive, but to thrive. And when that plane went down 850 miles south of Oahu with nobody else around, Louis and Phil said to each other, we're going to make this. And they knew that at that time, at least they thought, that 21 days was the longest anybody had survived on an inflatable raft out in the open ocean. It was actually 34 a few months before, but they hadn't heard that story yet. But they're thinking, 21 days, we can do this. 21 days, we can do this. And so they were just determined no matter what. And they realized that there was a life raft, and then another one, and so they got those 2 life rafts together, and in each life raft there was a little packet, a little box of supplies, such as Hershey's chocolate. Of course, they all needed that. Now, I read that it wasn't the kind of chocolate that we buy at the store. This was really bitter chocolate, and it was supposed to help keep people alive. So I kind of like the idea of dark chocolate, bitter chocolate, keeping people alive. But the idea was that they were only supposed to take 2 little segments per day, and then that would last them about 21 days. They also had this little kit to call attention to any airplanes or ships that might go by. There was a little mirror in there. There was sea dye that they would put out, and the ocean all around them would turn a vibrant color of yellow or whatever, so that anybody flying overhead would look down and say, what is that? And then they would spot, a raft in the middle of it. And then they had a couple of flare guns. They also had a couple of tools, about 2 pints of water and a little bit of fishing line with some fish hooks on it, and a patching kit, which was very important because if there started to get holes, obviously, in the inflatable life raft, they needed something to patch it up with. So Louis and Phil just said, this doesn't look very good, but we can do this. We're going to make it. Mac, on the other hand, said on day one, we're all going to die. We're never going to make it. Why even bother? And when Louis Zamperini and Phil were sleeping and Mac was supposed to stay awake and watch for them, he ate all of the chocolate. He was not a very nice person in their eyes, but you know what? They forgave him, and they said, okay, we need all 3 of us to work together. And the whole time, he just seemed to complain and talk about how they were going to die. And so Louis Zamperini and Phil just had to ignore most of what Mac was saying, and they kept telling each other, if we believe we can make it, maybe we can make it. We just have to believe that we can make it. And they knew that they had to stay strong physically, and so they did things so that they would, make it physically. But they also knew that so much of their survival depended on what happened in their minds. And so they played games with each other, and they remembered things, and they made each other talk to each other about the past and about what it was going to take to stay alive and about what they were going to do and what they were going to eat when they finally made it home at the end of 21 days. Well, 21 days came and gone, and they were still out there on this life raft. And I think it was day 27. Finally, an airplane flew over their head, and they started screaming and using their little things to make sure that they called attention to the pilots. And imagine the joy they felt when that plane circled around and came right down towards them to let them know that they had been seen. At least that's what they thought. But imagine their surprise when that airplane opened fire and started shooting holes in their life raft and trying to kill them. It was the Japanese. And they realized that these were Americans, and so they all jumped into the ocean knowing that there were sharks in there because they had just seen them, and thinking, well, we're probably going to have better luck with the sharks than the Japanese shooting at us. So they were swimming around next to the life raft underneath it, just hoping that they would survive this. And as soon as the shooting stopped, they climbed back into the life raft, realizing that there was holes throughout all the life raft, but at least the Japanese were gone. They weren't still shooting at them. Well, they thought, okay, this is going to be a little tough patching the life raft because they had to get out of the water in underneath it to patch some of it. And guess who noticed them, or what noticed them? The sharks. So one person would have to volunteer to jump in the water while the other 2 were beating off the sharks with their oars. This is a story of just amazing survival. So, day 46, they spot land. Amazing that this could even happen. Now, Mac, unfortunately, had died by then. His self-fulfilling prophecy had actually happened. We're all going to die. We're never going to make it. But the 2 that kept saying, we've got to keep trying. We have to believe that we can make it. The 2 of them were left, and they saw land way out in the distance. It was an island, and they thought, okay, we don't have much energy left, but let's get out these oars and these paddles, and let's make it to the island. And lo and behold, right as they started heading towards the island, a typhoon hit. And it was described like a roller coaster without having a roller coaster car to sit in. They were just being tossed all over the place, up and down, and anybody else probably would have died. But they just held on to those rafts, which they had patched, and they just held on for dear life, and luckily, both of them made it through the typhoon. And as I read the book, I just thought, how in the world is it possible that these 2 men survived by just the sheer will of staying alive? But they did. So the next day, they actually got out of their boat and crawled up onto a beach on that island, just so thankful to touch land again and praying that somebody friendly would find them and they could go home. Unfortunately, the Japanese found them, and they spent the next 2 years in prisoner of war camps in Japan being tortured physically and emotionally. unfortunately for Louis Zamperini, there was a particular guard that was the head of the entire POW camp that found out that Louis had been an American hero because of his running career. And he somehow found out that he had held the high school state record, or national record, the collegiate record, and had competed in the Olympics. And everyone is expecting him, to do really well in the next Olympics, whenever they might be. What Louis didn't know at the time is that all of his family thought he had died, and President Roosevelt had actually sent a letter of condolence to the family. Nobody even knew back home that Louis had made it. How in the world would it be possible out in the middle of the Pacific for somebody to survive? So anyway, this one particular person by the name of Corporal Watanabe decided that his mission in life at that point was going to be to break Louis Zamperini. It's like, well, if this is an American hero, let's have some fun. And he tortured him physically and emotionally the very best he could. And people around him just thought, how is this guy even still alive? Amazingly, at the end of the war, he went home looking pretty broken. He didn't have the energy, of course, that he had when he went into the war. He didn't look the same. He had been beaten and tortured for 2 years after that horrible ordeal at sea, and it was amazing to know that he lived to be almost 100 years old. He died actually, I think 2 years ago at Christmas time, but he would have been 100 years old this January if he had lived just a couple more years. But the amazing thing is that he did survive. Now, unfortunately, when he got home, he underwent this identity crisis, the thing that kept him alive the whole time he was at sea and in the POW camp just seemed to have left him, and he started drinking. He had these horrible nightmares about the war, and he also had PTSD, about as bad as you could get it. And so he drank in order to sleep, and he drank in order to forget, and he just kept sinking lower and lower and lower. And everything that he knew in terms of how he related to his family, his community, and the nation, it was all gone. And then one day, miraculously, he remembered a prayer that he had prayed when he was out on that boat. And he just said, "Oh Lord, if you will save me, I will serve you forever." And for some reason that popped into his mind, and he found his old Bible, and he opened it up and started reading it, and he started going to church, and something happened in his life where he had this turnaround conversion experience where he just knew that it was time to give up this feeling of being a victim, and he decided he was going to serve God and serve people, however it was that God was going to lead him. And at that point, he had no idea. As it turned out, he spent most of the rest of his life serving underprivileged and troubled youth, teenagers in particular. But what was really interesting was when he found his identity, he was able to turn his life around and do something so positive for so many people, and died, actually, I think, a greater hero than when he had left for the war. He had had an amazing experience, and as I was reading his story and knowing he was a Christian and talked about his Christian faith, it occurred to me that he had encountered the risen Christ. And when he did that, he realized that everything else that was an accomplishment of his past, his records and the record in the mile when he was in high school, in college, and everything else that just gave him so much of his identity didn't matter to him at all anymore. What he realized, what was most important, was that he was a child of God. And no matter what he had accomplished or not accomplished, no matter what he had experienced or not experienced, God loved him as a child of God. And he knew that he was God's dearly beloved. And that's what gave him the energy and the will to be this new person, to serve God, to serve the risen Savior, and to serve people, and in particular, troubled youth. As I was reading this morning our epistle lesson from 1 Corinthians that Kay read to us just a little while ago, it occurred to me that there's somebody else that we all know about that also had an amazing experience with the risen Christ, and that is the Apostle Paul. In fact, he was so far from what Jesus was about, God kind of had to just knock him down on the middle of a road and say, "What are you doing?" But the Apostle Paul had this incredible conversion experience where he encountered the risen Christ. And in 1 Corinthians 15, which we just heard a little while ago, that's the story that Paul is telling about his experience with a resurrection. And he begins telling the story by saying, Jesus just showed up. He showed up to James, he showed up to the 12, he showed up to the rest of the apostles, and then he says, and lastly, he showed up to me. And then the very last verse that Kay read for us this morning goes like this. By the grace of God, I am what I am. And if you read all of 1 Corinthians, you know that there's a really good reason that particular letter is called Paul's love letter to the Christian church. Because Paul had experienced in the risen Christ God's love. And Paul used to brag about all of his accomplishments and his pedigree, and finally said, none of that matters anymore. The only thing that matters is Jesus Christ and God and our relationship, because it's all about love. And just as God has loved me, I'm now able to love everybody else, even my enemies. And the Apostle Paul did just that. By the grace of God, I am what I am. And it was interesting to me that both Paul and Louis Zamperini were able to have these turnaround experiences through a change of identity, but it really wasn't a change of identity at all, was it? It was a change in their understanding of their identity. They realized that more than anything else, they were God's children, and God loved them, and their role in life was just to accept all that love that God had for them, knowing that it was so great it just automatically overflowed into everybody else's lives. That's really the Easter story, isn't it? We all encounter the risen Christ in different ways, and the Apostle Paul was actually pointing out that all these different people in the list that Kay read for us, they encountered Jesus at different times in different ways, and they were different people. And in the same way today, we encounter the risen Christ. And I invite you to imagine with me for just a moment what it would be like if you said those same words as the Apostle Paul and really meant them. By the grace of God, I am what I am, a child of God, dearly loved by God, with so much love coming to me that the only thing I can do is to let that love flow out into the lives of all the people around me, into all the world. That's the Easter message. Happy Easter.